All right. So, bonus episode number 2, I think.
Yeah.
The Pride and Prejudice critical section from the Norton here. The index that has the excerpts from various essays about Pride and Prejudice.
The fourth critical edition, edited by Donald Gray and Mary Favre. And this is the same, I guess, basic edition they've been rolling with since 1966 as far as text, but they keep updating it. And 2016 was the last time, which says Norton has a lot of faith in this particular core editing choices, and that they've just added apparatus. I guess it means the apparatus changes each edition, but the text they were always happy with.
Yeah, I would assume.
I think.
Yeah, introductions and indices and all that would change.
Yeah,
but otherwise,
maybe footnotes change.
So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and it shouldn't be a surprise, right? I mean, there was that kind of big push to kind of bring Austen back in the '80s, is my memory, and it wouldn't kind of shock me to know that that was sort of pretty much established already by then, but. I don't have, just I guess full disclosure, I don't have anything super deep to say about some of this other than I want to kind of maybe point out some things that I just found really really interesting on a kind of personal level, and kind of how we might look at that. I guess depends on what you want to say, but to be honest, really one of the essays really stood out to me among the selection, but I don't want to necessarily set us on a particular path. So what are your thoughts about how to tackle that?
Well, I enjoyed the first, I guess the first 3, or is it 4? I guess 3 are 19th century responses.
Right.
And I found it interesting, the very first one, you just get a 2-page excerpt from a guy named Richard Whately.
Right.
He published this in 1821, and he makes this claim that felt kind of fresh and new in some ways and outdated. First of all, it's interesting that back then they would just say Miss.
Right.
One of the titles is Miss Austen from Margaret Oliphant. Nowadays, they just, of course, use the last name, but that's definitely a marker of old writing. But this guy, Richard Whately, talks about the sensationalism of the novels that came before Austen at the end of the 18th century was clearly getting on his nerves. Right. And he appreciates what he considers to be Austen's realism.
Right, which is a constant reference.
And that stayed all the way through the 20th century. And, it's a pretty fresh, energetic. He has a great sentence, where he says, the substitute for these excitements, he's talking about the excitements of the 18th century, which had lost much of their poignancy by the repeated and injudicious use of them, was the art of copying from nature as she really exists in the common walks of life and presenting to the reader, instead of the splendid scenes of an imaginary world, a correct and striking representation of that which is daily taking place around them. And I thought that was pretty cool. But then, there's an essay by Andrew Elfenbein, and I guess he published this in 2013, called Austen's Minimalism.
Right.
And I didn't get to read this all that closely, but I found it an interesting juxtaposition with all the celebrations of her realism. It starts on page 331.
Yeah.
But he spends a lot of time in the excerpt we're given talking about what strikes him about her the most is the stuff Austen leaves out. She doesn't give you a painstaking description of setting. It's just like the room or the tree. He says, he even goes so far in 332 as to say, this seeming indifference to setting is not unusual in Austen. A long tradition of reading Austen as a master realist has masked her weird experimental minimalism. And then he complicates that by saying, the next paragraph, this is all in 332, although when earlier critics described Austen's minimalism, they meant her focus on supposedly small things. I use it instead to describe
I love this
her
line.
skilled, odd omissions. And so I guess like I'll just start by saying I think there's a lot of fruitful ground there that in a way reminds me of some of Marianne's rants about sensibility and romantic painters and poets.
Yeah.
Somehow striking that balance between I don't even know, poets like H.D. or Ezra Pound or, that kind of minimalism where you just kind of leave out all this stuff.
Right.
But also you're a realist. Like, how is she both exactly from the lens of 2023? So I'm starting less with an observation than just an intrigue.
Well, I like that, and I underlined that skilled odd omission, and then there's the example of like, the young ladies were summoned, and they left the scene of their conversation, which the narrator describes simply like as by a hedge.
Yeah.
And I find myself imagining a kind of Christopher Guest style staging of this, and the cast and the director spending 30 minutes arguing about like what that means to be by a hedge. Or some Andy Warhol style.
Some
thing.
actor asking, "What's my motivation here?"
Or even just something where like where instead of an actual set, there's just sort of like butcher paper and hedge is printed in big block letters, or something. And I think part of what all of these arguments have in common, the earlier arguments have in common, is they seem to be saying some version of the thing I like about Austen, the thing I appreciate about Jane Austen.
Yeah.
Is she cuts to what matters. That she doesn't sort of do a bunch of unnecessarily frivolous kind of sentimental cross stitch all around this thing. At the same time that she doesn't unnecessarily pepper this landscape with unnecessary detail. That what she's really talking about is the kind of the systems in which people live. Yeah. And as such, this other stuff is kind of, it is necessary in that, Marianne needs a place to stand, right? But in some ways, it's a matter of indifference.
And even Elfin's, what is it? Elfenbein.
Elfenbein, yeah.
He comes close to suggesting at one point something that like, I went, oh yeah. Like he says, for all the emphasis on fashion in Austen and gender and sex,
which is really from the movies as much.
It's like if you read the books, there's not even all that much emphasis on what they look like. Like you really yes. Like at some point, Jane is called the prettiest of the Bennets, and at another point, Marianne we're supposed to think is like super pretty, but like really, it's dialogue, and it's like. I guess we're supposed to believe, the men wouldn't be responding to them this way if they weren't hot. But that's us doing reader response writing onto it. Like, all we know for sure is that the men are affected.
Well, yeah.
She does not describe these women or their clothes in nearly the detail you would think, based on just pop culture.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit further on in 335, I underlined a couple bits that are not quite connected geographically on the page, but certainly are connected in terms of their ideas. But right at the bottom of that section, right before the break, Pride and Prejudice instead develops a counter-aesthetics that locates realism not in the pile-up of sensory detail, but in an awareness of how human perception makes the same space look different to different observers.
Yeah, that's it. That's the passage I was thinking of.
And I think what we're seeing from Elfenbein there is this idea that it doesn't matter if she had a big nose or a little nose or whatever. What matters is that in this space she is perceived a certain way, right? That the way that these people behave is in some ways overdetermined by the systems in which they live. And he kind of emphasizes this 2 paragraphs down. Instead of giving us detailed images of the contents of a room, Austen makes us aware of how the room cordons off inner and outer spaces to be entered and exited.
Yes.
And I think that there's some maybe I'm going to take some license and say there's some metaphor there that's not really just about entering and exiting the room. It's about kind of the ability to navigate the entire society the way that one does,
Yeah.
within that context. We were just talking about something else that involved, sort of different sort of cultures
Yeah.
and how that radically changes, the way you might perceive the same thing. I mean, nothing profound about that, right? I mean, it's a Yojimbo.
But for an 1813 novelist to be
Well, I
pointing
mean,
it out is
for
very
me to-
different.
for me to say that is
Right.
not.
Us saying it here, not a big deal. But I think one of the
Yeah.
reasons I think we all love Austen. I mean, anybody bothering to watch this video,
Right.
they're probably not doing it because they love us, because they like Austen. I think one of the reasons people love her is that, like, her way of looking at the world can still feel contemporary.
Yeah.
Like, even though it's still conjuring her moment.
Well, and
you know?
I think the other thing it does, and this is maybe partly important to me, just because it's a thing that I'm always interested in, regardless of the author. But the other thing it does is it kind of inverts or otherwise kind of turns on its head these genre expectations that I think go back to Richard Whatley and the realism argument that I think that there is this dynamic of pleasure when we pick up a piece of genre fiction and it exceeds its own type. When you pick up something that's going to be a romance novel and then it turns out to actually have some profundity, or it's actually really well written, or it actually renders these characters in this way that is different than just like the 5 types that we've come to see. And I think that part of what really everybody from Whatley to Elfenbein are kind of getting at is that she emerged from this moment that was full of sensational novels about young women trying to get married and said, but look at what it can do.
Yeah.
And it was her ability to just stand out in this, otherwise somewhat limited form.
Yeah.
And to show, it's like that thing where, the beginner, musician says like, oh, if I just had a really expensive version of my instrument, I'd sound better, and the seasoned pro just, takes that instrument and shows them that no, it could sound just fine if you knew what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's really where Austen. I'm gonna go on a limb and I'm gonna say at its core that is the essential value of Austen, that she took what was supposed to be this frivolous, time waster of a genre at the time and still.
Yeah.
And demonstrated to the world that you could do real and important things with it.
I'm looking up this title because everything you're saying reminds me so much about David S. Reynolds' famous book, Subversive. Okay, so he's got this book that I'm sure you know. It's from like 1985.
I don't know that I do.
Beneath the American Renaissance, the subversive imagination in the age of Emerson and Melville. And I used that book for my dissertation, and he was making very much the same arguments about all the American romantics that you're saying about Austen. And so, like, for Melville, he was writing in an era where the American culture was awash, no pun intended, in hunting stories and whale stories, some of which were based on real life, some of which were hoaxes, but like sea adventure tales were a big genre.
Right.
In the 1830s and 40s.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
Right.
people made money doing it. Poe, same thing.
Yeah.
Like, the horror stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And so, like...
The South Pole.
Yeah. He says that Melville, he calls it an act of synthesis, to take like a pop genre and you synthesize the stuff that's in there and then you elevate it to something else. And it's interesting to think about Austen doing this at the turn of the 19th century in England. He may have even mentioned her, I don't know if he did or not, but it's interesting, you're putting it almost exactly like I remember him talking about Hawthorne and Melville and those cats,
I think this is part of a potentially infinite cycle.
Yeah.
Right. That these new forms emerge. They are novel and superficial, right? And then as we get more apt at performing them, we see the potential for greatness in them.
Yeah.
And then somebody, I'm thinking in our lifetime,
like Ford's Westerns,
right?
like the
right.
golden era, like
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. And in our lifetime, one of the things we might see is that evolution of rough print comic books to the sort of graphic novels of today. Where although I'm sure someone would object to to that characterization, but this idea that or even, I mean, this is we're stretching a little bit before either of us were born, but I think we see that in like what was the sort of pulpy science fiction that has since become in some cases Nobel worthy writing. And so this idea that you kind of I believe, at least, and I'm not prepared to sort of make a really grounded argument, but I believe that in some ways these great writers that we used to sort of feel confident putting in a canon that we don't so much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that they all had in common was that they took these superficial forms and found ways to plumb depths with them. And this is exactly what I think we're seeing in Austen. And kind of to speak to that, if we jump forward just to the next thing, to Peter Knox Shaw.
Okay.
I thought that this was profoundly interesting. This is the essay that I was talking about that I really zeroed in on.
See, this is the one what
about
page
the
is
picturesque.
Okay, page 338. Yes. A politics of the picturesque.
Yes,
Yeah, that was a good one, wasn't it?
And as you know, I'm always interested in sort of region and place and authenticity in the depictions of these things, and I think that the arguments that we're seeing in the Knox Shaw essay are very much grounded in some of the things that I'm really interested in, and so that. Kind of full disclosure, like part of what's going on here is that I'm just interested in this because it's talking about something I think of as my thing.
Yeah.
But there is this kind of interesting thing, right? Because the early essays, the kind of pre 1980s or so. I don't know when was Knox Shaw was 2004, and.
These don't necessarily follow chronological order straightly.
Not exactly.
But
you're right. You're right, because Elfenbein is 2013. It looks like, but so with the Knox Shaw thing, I guess what I felt like I saw in the broader arc of the excerpts that we read, the early stuff was very much concerned with genre, culture, and gender, and how those things sort of intersected. And how Austen really, maximized on that. But then from sort of Knox Shaw up to probably Bonaparte, maybe to the one after Bonaparte, which is I think the next to last one, the Mishi, or however you say it,
Social Justice and Jane Austen,
Yeah, but through that, what I see is this kind of broader structuralist kind of thing that that is moving outside of, I think, the earlier focus on the limits of 19th century whateverness, and then towards the end we get to this kind of what feels to me like a kind of American studies, or well, I say that because that's my area. A kind of cultural studies approach that this is where we bring in Adam Smith and some of that fun stuff. But the Knox Shaw, and especially the emphasis on Gilpin, I think Gilpin is a super interesting character. I can't remember. Did you go? I know Dana was there, but I can't remember. Did you go to see that Tom Stoppard that we saw down on the main campus a few years ago? Were you at that one? I'm blanking on the name.
It wasn't Rosencrantz and Guildenstern.
No, it was the one about the tutor who falls in love with the girl.
I don't think I did go to that.
I'm blanking on the name of it. It was sort of fantastic, and one of the features of this play is this emphasis on sort of like early to mid 1800s sort of gardening theory, and the shift that we see happening in that, which I think is actually pretty important. To some of the stuff, maybe not Pride and Prejudice so much, but some of it. I think like it's in that garden house where Marianne is convalescing that I think it really comes into play here in some ways. I was forgetting that was this book, but this idea that Gilpin is largely famous for the invention of the picturesque, right? which I think is such an interesting sort of loaded term, right? I forget the exact wording, but it is that which is, commodious in a picture, or something like that. Which defines pleasure in a picture, or let me see, did I write it down? That which lends beauty and that is agreeable in a picture. I was overwriting it, I'm afraid. And in that is this idea of roughness. Right, where in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you want the pavement a little battered. You want the character is what people call it.
Let's not get everything centered just right. And later on we get it as this comparison to Burke's kind of like high, like music of the spheres, sophistication, and Gilpin is saying like, no, let's make things rough. Let's make things a little wild. And this was a huge thing for like the landed gentry at the time. To design their gardens, they would make those fake Roman ruins. And there was a feature that was very popular called a wahoo or a woohoo. It was basically a dip in the land, that was sort of, it kind of like gave it some character. And I think this is really interesting, right? Because one of the things that does then is it kind of like sort of the way that I'm saying Austen, takes this superficial, like dare I say, low class genre and do prestige work with it. I think Gilpin and kind of by extension, I think Knox Shaw is making this really great argument that says, if we read this minimalist landscape, one of the things we do see is Gilpin's ideas of the picturesque sort of coming to the fore, which means, there's this emphasis on kind of sort of rough simplicity, on this kind of like, not just the gentry, not just the ultra rich, not just the sort of, absolutely perfected artistry, of whatever, sophistication, this kind of Burkean, thing. And one of the things we're doing here is kind of like, I guess I want to say that we're seeing the seeds of this really important idea that comes to play in literature a little bit later, right? That I think this is maybe the very start of this, where we see, in the 1860s, 1870s, we see people saying, I'm going to write stories about poor people. Not pretend poor people. Right. Which is what we have in Austen. Like people who like can't quite afford the whole team of horses. Right. But I'm gonna write about. I always think about.
Dickens in the 1840s, even.
Right. That social justice literature that starts to sort of, that is the rough, didactic, formulaic version of what becomes really interesting stuff by the 1870s. Really prestige by then. I'm always reminded there's that great bit. I don't know if you were quite the watcher of Downton Abbey that I was, but one of the features of Downton Abbey is that it is also entailed, and the house can't go to the daughters. And so there's an American cousin who is the next, a
Collins figure,
right? Who is the next? Although a much more sympathetic, he was genuinely embarrassed by the whole circumstance. And he arrives, to sort of see the property that he's going to inherit, and he's deeply ashamed about the scenario, and in fact the people who he's essentially robbing, by his lights, are like, but you got to do it. And they're having dinner, and what's her name? Not Judi Dench. It'll come to me. The other sort of older English actress, Maggie Smith. Yeah, Maggie Smith plays the sort of Dowager Countess is her title, I guess. And they're all having dinner together, and the American, who's a banker, of course, makes some joke about just trying to get things done before the weekend. And Maggie Smith makes this sour face and goes, "What is a weekend?"
Yes.
And of course, highlights in this moment that is a completely artificial distinction that only matters if you work.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah.
That all days are the same if you don't have to like open your business.
Yes.
And so I think that what we see in this Knox Shaw argument, which is really great,
Yeah.
is this, I think, super pun intended fertile sort of approach to thinking about what we mean when we say beautiful and sublime, right? And one of the things that this emphasizes here at the bottom of 340, right, is movement, right? That we see a sudden, unexpected, and abrupt transitions from a certain playful wildness of character and appearance of irregularity, with a typical neglect of the boundaries between life and art. So this is the ideal, right?
Yeah.
And I am absolutely fixated. In fact, the big project I'm about to start is largely built around this idea that what makes a certain kind of literature not just good and interesting, but also useful, is this emphasis on movement and this neglect of boundaries. And we see that in this the way the very English way that they're just like walking through each other's estates, right? And the way that these things are kind of breakable,
Yeah.
in their way. And this is partly what allows the sort of fantastic kind of movement in this culture, that I think our earlier writers would talk about in terms of gender, but I think Peter Knox Shaw understands has a much broader implication.
Yeah, that is all, I think, dead on. I enjoyed that essay too. I mean, one of the things I liked about it is I found myself having to look up some of these artists and these art theorists,
yeah,
but
yeah.
also, it had some good. It's been a while since we read Pride and Prejudice, and his articles, like one of the ones that helped refresh me the most on what actually happened,
Right,
in the
yeah.
novel,
Yeah.
which was nice for me. It's been a minute since we read the novel, and
Yeah.
now we're reading the criticism, and that kind of colors things. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the essay about Pride and Prejudice and zombies. I want to talk about that one.
Yeah.
I actually thought about that in concert.
Now, have you read that
No.
book? Okay, I actually did read that book about
Yeah. But
4 or 5 years
But the
ago.
essay is by Tiffany Potter.
Right.
It's on 395. But I read it kind of against Vivian Jones's feminisms. Because Jones, talks about how Austen keeps getting appropriated, and I think it was that one, the Vivian Jones that says
she makes the point that I thought was really interesting in her point, or in her essay, was this idea that Austen was essentially post-feminist, that she was
Right.
that she was advocating for the wild idea that women are human beings, but also was willing to work within these structures
That's
that
right.
existed. Yeah.
And there also seemed to be, I think it was her essay that said that, or heck, maybe it was Tiffany Potter's. One of them talks about how it's interesting that, like, almost from the beginning of the 20th century, with every successive generation of anti-feminist voices, there's always people citing Austen as, see, she doesn't need all that, and then whatever feminism is defined as at that time. So
Right.
there's a way in which Elizabeth Bennet, according to, I guess, Jones and also Tiffany Potter, can be framed as, yes, she's defiant, yes, she's impertinent, but oh, look, she's also playing largely by the rules. She's not, she's not a slave to men, but she's not going around here like, being like some snowflake or whatever the current, incel criticism would be, that like she always becomes the sort of like go-to for anti-feminists,
Right.
according
Right.
to both of these essays. And even though that's problematic too. But in the zombies essay, what I loved was the comparison of the zombies as unmentionables to all the things in Jane Austen that can kind of be unmentionable.
Right.
And that Seth Graham Smith is pointing that out. So, readers in general have to, whether they like it or not, accept that for all the irony of the situation, the leading ladies in Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice do both marry up. They do both benefit from the very systems that we laugh at for the whole book.
Right. In part because they're good at operating in those systems.
And part of what makes Elizabeth Bennet so good at operating within the system, as several of these critics argue, is that she scoffs at it.
Right.
But she's playing within it enough to get the guy.
Exactly.
Whether now you're supposed to get the guy without trying to get the guy is what some of these critics are. They're trying to thread that needle where it's like
supposed to be some innate quality of hers and not some actual desire.
but you still end up getting all the fucking money. And so, in a way, this guy, Seth, what's his name? Seth Graham Smith, is sort of, according to Potter anyway, for him, the zombies in Austen is the truth that the heroines are playing, they're every bit as dirty as the villainesses are. It's like you just marry for money and that's it. And, Potter's argument's a little more nuanced than that, but that's a big part of it. And I enjoyed that, that interpretation of, of Graham Smith.
I actually liked the novel. I mean, it was, it was obviously cashing in on, the sort of zombie craze that followed The Walking Dead and all of that. But it also, I think, the novel itself, pretty clearly lent itself to this reading of, of what it meant, I mean, at its core, right, for people who don't know the Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, is part of this whole. I think it's the same person who wrote Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter.
Right.
And it's part of this whole franchise.
People don't really take the guy that seriously.
Right. But cooked into this is this idea that the sisters are outliers because they fight zombies when they're supposed to be these delicate female types. But then by fighting the zombies, they're also literally working to preserve the existing order.
Right, so that the father keeping them alive and the mother trying to marry them off turn out, ironically, to be fighting the same battle.
Right.
Like you do, and so this is also Potter's essay. Had I thought a beautiful treatment of Charlotte that made me want to go read this zombie book and also reread Pride and Prejudice, because we talked about Charlotte some when we did the book proper. But Potter says on 397 some sentences that I think are really nice, contemporary, I guess. When did she publish this?
Must have been very recent.
2012.
Yeah.
Contemporary, interesting discussion of the novel. She says, Austen's most heartbreaking depiction of marriage is not Lydia, right? Has always been that endured by Charlotte Lucas, who accepts a marriage to the obsequious social striver, this is all 397, Mr. Collins, because she knows that she has a social script to follow and she dares to imagine for herself, quote, only a comfortable home. And then moving a little bit further down, Charlotte's sacrifice, well, we find out her marriage, Potter says, has only solitary pleasures in her hours away from her husband, coming from her public standing as wife. Charlotte's sacrifice to unmentionable social and economic demands is reconsidered in Graham Smith's adaptation, where Charlotte marries Collins because she knows she has been stricken and will soon become ill herself. So Charlotte's become a zombie. And at the wedding, evidently in this novel, Charlotte's decomposing, according to Potter.
Yeah. She's been bitten.
But she's not going to die. Like her and Collins are just going to move. Well, but he has to cut her head off. And we're told on 398 that Collins's letter to the father, that Graham Smith, whether he meant to or not, gave Collins a lot more depth than Austen ever did. He ends up killing himself after beheading Charlotte, and says in his letter, the pompous Collins, Potter says, articulates what Austen's contemporaries well knew. For the good of a respectable family, a tragic death is less problematic than a scandal.
Right.
So, in this treatment of Collins being given more death and people actually killing each other and dying, I think Potter's also pointing out, how the scandal of Lydia in 1813, there were suggestions that like Mr. and Mrs. Bennet would have rather the girl just died,
Right.
which is super fucked up, right?
Yeah.
So I thought that treatment of this like silly novel
Yeah.
made me think about Austen in a new way and made me want to read the silly novel. I don't know,
It's worth a go, in a lot of ways, I think. But yeah, I think this is a good one to end on in the sense that, it kind of captures a lot of, what we've been talking about in terms of the critical reading of genre, kind of, sensational kind of pulp fiction then versus now, as well as some of the more profound points about, systems and social order, all of which I think, Austen did have a lot to say about, even as she sort of enjoyed the benefits of them to, whatever degree you wanna say she did. She sure wasn't like, writing, late at night after her, 12-hour shift at the textile mill. But
I know like piteously little about her. There's always biographical stuff in these books, but I have not read those. I don't even know if she ended up getting married herself.
Well, we know that she's poor.
Austen was
within her social class.
okay.
They have to sort of economize the way that a lot of these characters do.
Yeah.
But there's poor in this world, and then there's poor.
Would you say that like by our standards she would have looked middle class? Yeah.
I mean, there were certain embarrassments. I think they kept. I'm trying to remember the details because I don't pay as much attention to them as I might. Either I think they kept the coach and horses, but really struggled to do so, or else struggled and failed to do so.
Yeah.
But it's not like any of them had to go get jobs.
Yeah.
They were still living off these incomes of one sort or another, which I'm sure at the time was considered a real hardship for them. But as a 21st century reader, who grew up punching a clock.
It's the world's smallest violin.
I find a little bit, a little bit challenging.
That's what class, class issues sometimes have a hard time translating for that reason, in a way that sometimes I think we're less kind probably on class issues sometimes than we are on race and gender issues probably in ways that I'm still working out. I think that's also like true with our politics. Like we keep such a sliding scale of what it means to be working class, what it means to be poor, who's really suffering, and does it matter if you're suffering while this orientation or this gender or in this state or in this country, and like so there's never like this moment where it's like, yes, economically oppressed person, quite in the same way that it is like person living in India during English rule equals bad, or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, it's very difficult. Expectations and context are everything.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I love it. And we'll do Mansfield Park next, which I've read, but it's been a long time. And my understanding is she does get into politics in a way that is not minimalist. That's what I have heard.
My understanding is that this is the one where she does most of that work. So yeah, that's up next.
All right. Awesome.